Alright guys, how's it going? We're rapidly approaching the end of 2017, and I think it's safe to say that it's been a good year for the PC overall, but also something of a mixed bag. And for this video, I've decided to do one of those specials. I'll be taking a quick look at what happened in 2017 before analysing what the expectations are for 2018, and possibly taking a look just a little further ahead. So I think you're going to find this one pretty interesting. I'll get started on that soon, right after this message from the video sponsor. This video is sponsored by ICO Battles, through whom the investment platform CrowdWiz, which stands for Crowd Wisdom, launches their initial coin offering on the 20th of November. So what is CrowdWiz? Well, CrowdWiz is a self-governed investment ecosystem running on the safe and secure Ethereum blockchain. The decision-making process revolves around the wisdom of the crowd concept, using the collective opinion of the community and allowing each member to vote democratically on investment opportunities. This of course helps to eliminate middlemen while lowering costs and lowering risk, especially for those who might not have a high level of knowledge of cryptocurrency investment. So if your interest has been piqued, feel free to click on the link in the description below to go straight to CrowdWiz's easy and efficient signing up process. I will also be talking more about how it all works near the end of this video. Looking back over the year, in January, Intel launched their Kaby Lake series of CPUs to little fanfare, as they were nothing more than overclocked Skylakes on an improved 14nm plus process. By far the biggest and most important launch of the year was AMD's Ryzen series in March, bringing 8 cores and 16 threads to the mainstream price point for the first time ever, and more importantly, bringing the resumption of competition versus Intel. Also in March, Nvidia launched their 1080 Ti graphics card, but that was merely a cut down Titan X based on the previous year's GP102 technology. Around the middle of the year, AMD retook the CPU performance crown for the first time in over a decade with their 32-thread monster Threadripper 1950X. But during that time, most eyes were turned on Vega, and after the longest drawn-out launch in recent memory, it's safe to say that Vega was an underwhelming disappointment to most. In my recent review, in fact, MSI's 1080 Ti Gaming X was a massive 32% faster than the Vega 64 Liquid Edition. The last time we saw a gap like that at the high end was around 10 years ago. It's safe to say that Vega has shown promise recently in more recent titles, but to me the Nvidia card still looks the better choice. But during all this, the importance of having strong competition once more was seen, as Threadripper had forced Intel's hand, and they were soon back in the lead with their own monster CPU, the 36-thread Skylake X 7980XE, while at the same time launching the sadly inadequate Kaby Lake X, in a weird attempt at pushing quad cores into the high-end desktop space. As for Nvidia, their hands barely left their deep pockets, and their response to Vega was a similarly disappointing 1070 Ti. Again, a graphics card based on 18-month-old technology, minimum effort indeed. Later in the year, as Ryzen continued to gain traction, Intel's hand was once again forced. They had pulled in and paper-launched Coffee Lake, the first consumer segment 6-core CPUs, slamming quad cores firmly into the entry level where they belong. Now we had other relevant releases too. For example, we got our first glimpse of Optane, utilising 3D crosspoint memory from Intel. The jury's still out in that one, but I'll talk about that in another video. So that was the major 2017 talking points in a nutshell. Looking ahead to 2018, we'll start off with AMD, as they are expected to launch their follow-up Ryzen series, which I'm going to label Ryzen Plus, early next year, with the general consensus being around February. Whether or not they stick with Ryzen, which is one of their strongest brands in years, remains to be seen. But the strength of the brand makes me believe they will. About that expected release timeframe of February though, I'm really not so sure, and here's why. During the Ryzen launch earlier this year, we saw slides from AMD talking about Zen on 14nm and the follow-up Zen on 14nm plus. That clearly meant that AMD's manufacturing partner, GlobalFoundries, had been working on improving their 14nm process, and later this year in a press release we learned that they have a new incoming 12nm process, offering density and performance improvement over the current generation. In this press release, Mark Papermaster, who is AMD's Chief Technical Officer and SVP of Technology and Engineering, he said, "We are pleased to extend our long-standing relationship with GlobalFoundries as a lead customer for their new 12LP technology." Lead customer is fairly important, as AMD are by far GlobalFoundries' biggest customer. But the most important part being, we plan to introduce new client and graphics products based on GlobalFoundries' 12nm process technology in 2018 as a part of our focus on accelerating our product and technology momentum. Now the assumption here would be, for graphics at least, Vega gets a die shrink, or maybe it's even the rumoured Vega 11, which is supposed supposedly replacing Polaris. But graphics could also mean Polaris on 12 nanometers, possibly rebranded as the RX 680. There were previous slides showing Polaris in 2018 from AMD's Financial Analyst Day a few months ago, and in their recent investor presentation from November, once again shows Polaris in 2018. What this means, I simply don't know. Perhaps they're just considering pushing Polaris down a tier, maybe sticking Polaris 10 at the entry level. We just don't know. But it could be an interesting card on 12 nanometers, with the RX 680 maybe theoretically hitting around 1650 MHz. That should be a graphics card that is a lot faster than the GTX 1060. But whether or not that will matter is another talking point for another video, as obviously it's not very likely that Nvidia will sit still in 2018. But let's talk about Ryzen on the new 12nm process. On this slide, which comes from the recent GlobalFoundries Technology Conference, we can see what to expect in terms of performance uplift from the shrink. Now it starts off with an up to 15% improvement in circuit density. We already know that Ryzen, the Zeppelin die, is 213 square millimeters. So if we just take maybe an average 10% shrink of that, we could be looking at a new Zeppelin die of around 190 square millimeters. It's not a massive area drop, but it's essentially free. And this shrink also gives more than 10% improvement in performance over industry 16nm FinFET solutions. Now, a lot of people had been looking at this and thinking, okay, so it's 10% faster than GlobalFoundries' current 14nm. So what would this mean for Ryzen? Well, we already know that the 1800X has a base clock speed of 3.6 GHz and a turbo speed of 4 GHz. So you would simply just add 10% to that, giving us around 4 GHz base and around a 4.4 GHz turbo. This is likely what performance means in this context. But the interesting thing here is it's a more than 10% improvement, and it's not actually over GlobalFoundries' own 14nm, it's against the industry's 16nm FinFET solutions. Now, it's generally accepted that TSMC's 16nm process is better at high clock speeds compared to GlobalFoundries' 14nm. This is one of the reasons why Nvidia's graphics cards seem to clock higher. There does appear to be a gap of around about 10% in maximum clock speeds between TSMC's 16nm and GlobalFoundries' 14nm. So if GlobalFoundries is now saying that they've got 10% improvement in performance over that, then we could be talking even higher than 4 GHz, 4.4 GHz turbo. I actually had another idea though, where I came to the conclusion that AMD might actually slap on another 4 cores per CPU. So instead of the 4 cores per CCX, we'd have a new die with 6 cores per CCX, 12 cores overall instead of 8. This is an area where they could improve Zen. And it's something they've done in the past, where just over 1 year after launching their Phenom 2 architecture, which was a quad-core architecture, they launched Thuban maybe 14, 16 months later, which was essentially the same architecture with 2 more cores, which is also what Intel just did with Coffee Lake. So the area improvement here, this 15% improvement in circuit density, could be used up on more cores, and the performance improvement could actually also go to more cores as well. I'm not convinced about this argument, I'm just throwing it out there as a possibility. I would put the chances of that at around 15%. So don't quote me on that one, just consider the possibility, because it has been done before. Also notable here though is that design rework is minimised. So the shrink from 14nm to 12nm is not a major task. But for me, one of the more interesting parts was the risk production starting in the first half of 2018. Now obviously February is in the first half of 2018, but if risk production is only starting in the first half of 2018, and remember, I've talked about this before. Normally when slides say first half, they mean second quarter. So all of this together kinda makes me think that February launch for Ryzen Plus doesn't look very likely. But the thing here is, AMD are favoured partners of GlobalFoundries. As you know, they in fact founded GlobalFoundries in a spin-off in 2009. Both companies work very, very closely together. And for sure, AMD would get the process design kit as early as was possible. But for me, at best, you're looking at a paper launch February and March. Now, obviously, I would hope to be wrong about that. And it has to be said that DigiTimes, where the initial February rumour came from, they aren't often badly wrong. And they pretty much nailed the Ryzen release this year. They were accurate in many, many cases. And if AMD are telling the motherboard guys that February is the date, then I tend to believe that over anything else, regardless of what the logic says. So if I've just confused you with that there, then it's because I'm feeling pretty confused myself. Now, perhaps one of the reasons for this is, as you may have noticed, there has been a real lack of AMD talking about Ryzen Plus, which is in complete opposition to what we saw with Ryzen at this time last year. If you remember back, they had a slow release of data and then benchmarks over over the tail end of 2016 going into early 2017, and we saw Ryzen's performance improving all the time when pitted against Intel's i7 6900K. But this time around, we've had absolutely zero inkling of Ryzen Plus's performance. We simply know that it exists due to roadmaps, and the reason for this is simply down to AMD already having a successful Ryzen product on the market, and they don't wish to Osborne it. If you just look at the way they dealt with Ryzen and Vega, they were shouting from the rooftops about these products because they had no products of their own in the market that they could upset. Think about Nvidia, they never talk about the future products because they simply Osborne current ones. In fact, during Nvidia's recent Q2 financial conference, when asked about future products, Nvidia's CEO Jensen Huang pointed out how great Pascal was and will be for the foreseeable future. Even at the most recent Q3 financial conference, when asked again about future products, he said, Pascal is still ramping. They just don't want to talk about what's coming next, because people are still buying the current generation, and in big numbers it has to be said. Intel, they rarely talk about future products either, but since Ryzen launched, they pulled in Coffee Lake for a massive paper launch, effectively killing off their current generation KB Lake 3 or 4 months early. There is no way that they would have done this if Ryzen wasn't doing well in the market, and we can see here that just recently, Intel has pulled in even more fabs for Coffee Lake, which is something I will also cover later in this video. But getting back to 12nm, at AMD's recent third quarter earnings call, analyst Matt Ramsey of Canaccord asked AMD's CEO Lisa Su about their 12nm and their 7nm roadmap. I'll deal with 7nm later, but on 12nm, Lisa said, we do see an opportunity with 12nm. 12nm is a relatively small engineering lift, as we just discussed, and I would view it as a performance enhancement to our current roadmap. And so we are working on taking some of our products, a subset of our products, into 12nm in 2018 to augment the performance of our client and graphics roadmap. So once again, this is really just reiterating what Mark Papermaster said. Graphics and client, Vega, Polaris and Zen. And there's something interesting about this, because they're not talking about the data center. They're not talking about epyc here. And we also know that AMD just released Raven Ridge for mobile. That's Ryzen Mobile with Vega graphics. So what we could be seeing here is GlobalFoundries 12nm node. It may have been custom built for AMD, but more importantly, for the desktop market. So this is pretty interesting. I mean, Raven Ridge is just out on mobile. They are not going to shrink that to 12nm right now. They are clearly talking about Ryzen, Vega, and maybe Polaris. The interesting part about this is we know that Zen is struggling to get past 4.1, 4.2 GHz, maybe 4.3 GHz maximum with some of the Threadripper products, but 4 GHz is certainly more realistic. And this looks like a hard limit of the 14nm process. At 4 GHz, Ryzen remains very competitive in performance per watt, so they're not limited by power draw, they appear to be limited by the process, which simply will not go over a certain speed. And under normal circumstances, I would have thought this was likely to remain the case with 12nm, but given the fact that AMD is targeting client and graphics with the node, rather than server, which would require performance per watt. Server CPUs don't want maximum clock speed, they want maximum performance per watt. But it looks like AMD is skipping 12nm for epyc, their data center CPUs. So the 12nm process may just have been built specifically for Ryzen on the desktop, and also for the graphics too. So it is possible that this fairly low ceiling of around 4.1 GHz, that may have been lifted with 12nm, and we could even see higher than 4.4 turbo. One possible way to increase the maximum clock speeds on a process would be to increase the length of the fins, like what Intel has been doing over the years. Another possibility here is that XFR could work properly, unlike the current offering, which barely does 0.1 GHz, maybe 0.2 GHz in specific cases. I highly doubt that AMD developed this technology simply for that, but it is the hard limit of the 14nm process which holds XFR back. Could we possibly see 5 GHz single thread on this 12nm process? Maybe. But do not quote me on that one. Whatever happens, it seems likely that Ryzen Plus should at least offer 10% performance improvement over current Ryzen, and that is purely on a faster process, and before any IPC gains. But what about IPC gains? Well, there are numerous possibilities with Ryzen. Some examples may be optimizations in the Infinity Fabric, or faster memory speed compatibility. There's another IPC gain that we already know about. To be honest with you, it's not really an IPC gain, but we already saw Raven Ridge's new turbo, which offers far better tuning possibilities than Ryzen. Even something like that might contribute 1 to 2%. And while that's not an awful lot, that's the kind of increases that Intel simply cannot get any longer with their Lake CPUs. Overall, for me, AMD and Ryzen Plus, with the higher clock speeds and the low-hanging fruit IPC gains, I will be disappointed with anything less than 15% more performance over current Ryzen. The interesting thing for me here is that this could be seen in very good gains in gaming, assuming that 15% goes directly to removing that small single-thread deficit remaining between Ryzen and Intel's most recent CPUs. So that's enough on Ryzen and 12nm for now. Let's take a look at what Intel is going to be doing. As you're all aware, Intel just recently launched Coffee Lake, still on 14nm. That was the most interesting thing about it, in fact, and many of you will now be aware that Intel is having a really tough time getting their 10nm in shape. The first inkling of trouble was way back in mid-2015, when Intel announced Kaby Lake, which was again on 14nm. But actually the real delay started with the Haswell refresh back in 2014. Up until this point, Intel were following tick-tock. One year they would do a tick, which was a shrinking process, for example shrinking their process between 32nm and 22nm, and then the year afterwards they would do a tock, which would be architectural advancements on the same process. But with Haswell refresh on 22nm, they basically admitted that they were having a problem getting to 14nm. It became clear in 2015 that this was here to stay. We're over at Anandtech, they said tick-tock was on the rocks. Not even 1 year later, Intel finally comes clean and renames tick-tock to Process Architecture Optimization. And here you can see the difference. I think it's safe to say though that nobody was really expecting what happened next, because what was tick-tock became Process Architecture Optimization, which then turned into Process Architecture Optimization. Basically what you're looking at here is the 14nm process, the first CPU was the Broadwell CPU. The architecture change after that was Skylake, and then we know that optimization was Kaby Lake, followed by Coffee Lake. So both Broadwell and Skylake were done on the 14nm process, and the first Kaby Lake optimization was 14nm plus, and the second optimization was 14nm plus. And as I mentioned earlier, they also threw on another couple of cores. So 10nm in pretty bad shape, but they'll fix it eventually, right? Well, maybe not. This was actually a very interesting article, and financial analyst Ashraf Issa had spoken to Intel's VP and GM of Client and Internet of Things, Dr. Venkata, known as Murthy Renduchintala, and he let slip a very interesting snippet of information, and that was process tech use will be fluid based on segment, and this can only mean one thing. In 2018, Intel will be sticking with 14nm for their desktop CPUs. Now, Ashraf is a technology specialist with the Motley Fool, and he also owns shares in Intel. So this is not some fanboy who has an axe to grind, but he certainly wasn't holding back in his article the price of Intel Corporation's 10nm failure, where he noted that the delay in mass production of 10nm was basically a delay of 2 years, or roughly a full generation. But it's about to get a lot worse, because by Intel's own admission, its first and second generation 10nm, that is 10nm and 10nm plus, will offer worse performance than its upcoming 14nm plus technology. Their new 10nm process is no better, and in fact worse than the current process that we see with Coffee Lake. And Intel says that the company's 10nm technology won't open up a clear performance lead over 14++ until its third iteration, imaginatively titled 10nm++, which should go into production sometime in 2020. And this is an extreme failure on the part of Intel's chip manufacturing group. Charlie over at SemiAccurate has been talking about Intel's 10nm process problems for a very long time. And as his article says, note the plural. There is not one thing wrong with Intel's 10nm. There are at least 2 things, and possibly even 3. The obvious one is yield. Intel simply cannot get good yields on the process. This is something that also plagued their 14nm process early on, so it's really no great surprise. But there also seems to be problems with parametric yield, and rumour has it that clock speeds are actually worse on 10nm than they are on 14, which is why performance is worse. And then finally, over at DigiTimes again, they reported that the Intel GPU integrated Cannon Lake may not be ready until year-end 2018. The most interesting part here is that some vendors are even considering skipping Cannon Lake to wait for the release of its successor, the Ice Lake CPUs, which according to Intel's roadmap should be available shortly after the specific processor's rescheduled launch. So Cannon Lake frankly looks like a bust, and it appears to be all down to the very poor 10nm process. So what are Intel going to do in the face of all this? Some of you just may find this unbelievable, and I can certainly understand why. And I've talked about one or two things in this video already, which have definitely been speculative, but this is not speculation. Intel's 10nm process is in an awful state, and there appears to be no end in sight to the problems. They will be releasing 10nm CPUs, but it's those tiny little U and Y CPUs at very low TDP, and it should be pretty interesting to see how those perform. The larger CPUs they simply cannot make, and those that they can make have worse performance than their current generation parts. So what is Intel gonna do in 2018? We've just seen from AMD, 12nm is coming. At the very least, the gap will be closed dramatically to Coffee Lake. And I'm talking 6-core 12-thread Ryzen against the 6-core 12-thread Coffee Lake. The 8-core 16-thread Ryzen Plus will be a much faster CPU than the 8700K. So what will Intel do? We already know what they're gonna do. They're gonna slap on another 2 cores yet again. As we learned from Eurocom support that they were planning to update Tornado F5 to the Z390 chipset, supporting 8-core 16-thread CPUs coming in the second half of 2018. So once again, another optimized 14nm. I don't even know if they'll bother renaming it. I doubt it. They'll probably just stick to Coffee Lake, but you never know. All indications point to Intel competing next year against Ryzen Plus for the vast majority of the year with their current 8700K CPU, and later on in the year it will be updated to 8 cores 16 threads, still on 14nm. And to finish this one up, it's just gonna get worse for Intel. Remember epyc, the French magazine who last year accurately leaked the first Ryzen results? They just recently got wind of Zen 2, not Zen Plus, not Ryzen Plus, Zen 2. This is a 7nm one that is coming, and it is also coming at the end of 2018. And what's more, it has double the core count. Second generation EPYC CPU will have 64 cores. As you know, that is 4 CPUs glued together with the Infinity Fabric, so 16 cores per CPU, a massive 256 megabyte of L3, that is quadruple what EPYC has, and also DDR4 at 3200 MHz. Now the cache is an interesting one. It should be 128 megabytes, but there's a couple of reasons for why they've gone with 256. Could be a different type of cache, but I won't be going into that in this video. It may also just be quadrupled cache, as that would be one surefire way of dramatically increasing IPC. And this is all a trade-off because, I mean, sure, quadruple the cache is going to make for larger die sizes, and so does doubling cores, but the whole CPU will be shrunk to 7nm. AMD will make that trade-off of going with a larger die size if they know they have knockout performance. And at 64 cores per CPU, going up against Intel's 28-core Skylake server CPUs, that is one that Intel simply cannot even get close to competing with. And if you've just understood what I've talked about in the process, it should be crystal clear that on 10nm, the chances of Intel coming back with a large CPU, which has no chance of yielding, and even if it did, the performance would be worse anyway. The only thing left here is for either AMD or GlobalFoundries to mess this up. And those of you that follow the industry closely will immediately think, well, guaranteed GlobalFoundries will mess it up. They messed up 32nm, and they messed up their own 14nm so badly that they had to license Samsung's 14nm instead. But they have not messed up 7nm. And everything I've read so far about 7nm, from the likes of Lisa Su and Mark Papermaster, and GlobalFoundries' own people, they are all saying the same thing, that GlobalFoundries 7nm is in very good shape. But it's not just GlobalFoundries saying it, there are experts within the industry saying the same thing. So all that's left here for me is for AMD to mess this up in 2018. But I really don't think so this time. They're not doing anything dramatically different. They're just improving on an already great architecture. That's a difficult thing to mess up. And for the first time in maybe 20 years almost, it actually looks like they're bringing everything together at the same time, just when their closest rivals appear to be capitulating. So back to CrowdWiz. As I noted earlier, November the 20th is CrowdWiz's launch day, and since the huge success of their pre-launch in October, this is the most anticipated ICO. To give you some more details of how it works, the CrowdWiz ecosystem revolves around a concept of ICO tokens called Wiz tokens. Among other things, these Wiz tokens allow a member to cast their votes on investments, and during the launch there will be bonuses to subscribers. For example, between the 20th and 23rd of November, there is a 15% bonus to Wiz tokens, so $1,000 will get you 11 1150 Wiz tokens. Between the 23rd and 28th of November, the bonus will be 10%, and from the 28th November until the 8th of December, there will be a 5% bonus. The bonus opportunity does run out after the 8th of December though, so if you're interested in cryptocurrency investment, then I would encourage you to get in early to avoid missing out in this exciting new venture. There's a link in the description below which will take you to their website. It's easy and efficient to use. You can even set up your own funds and invite friends and family to join in. So be sure to at least check it out. If you thought 2017 was a good year for CPUs, 2018 is going to be even better. We are not going to see the results of 7nm in 2018, but I think we'll be surprised by what Ryzen Plus brings. And I for one expect to see even fiercer competition than what we got in 2017. Sadly, on the graphics front, I don't expect anything. Nvidia, deservedly so, are out of sight because they just keep making really fast graphics cards. And in fact, I expect the gap to grow because Nvidia are competing with themselves, their own customers, while the Radeon Technologies Group appears to be doing something completely different. We're not going to see a knockout blow for Intel. They're simply too big and they're too heavily integrated in too many institutions, but they're going to have a rough time of things. They got off easy in 2017. They will struggle to get off as easy in 2018. And in the second half of the year, all roads are leading to Rome, and I expect to see some truly epic benchmarks that will have a lot of people just struggling to comprehend. That is my predictions for 2018. I hope you enjoyed this one. As always, check out the description for links. I'll be back soon with some more videos, and I'll catch you later, guys.